Hello once again, it's Matthew here from Matthewnorthmusic, and as ever, if you enjoy these kind of videos that I make, be them about electronics, music, records or whatever, please hit the like and subscribe buttons because they really do help this channel to grow. Anyway, today's video. Now, originally I wasn't going to make a video about this, but as I started working on this project, it became more and more interesting to me. And it turned out that this amplifier wasn't quite as expected. So I kind of thought, after I'd done the initial strip down, oh, I should have really made a video about this. However, while looking up information about this amp, I found the WEM Owners Club on Facebook. And I searched for this amp that I had, and lo and behold, the guy I bought it off had actually posted there. And so I'm going to go back about 2 years, maybe a little bit longer, and have a look at these photographs. These were the photographs from the original Facebook Marketplace sale of this amp. And as you can see, this amp is really grotty and filthy. It's a Watkins Dominator 25 combo, which had been cut down to be an amplifier head. And, you know, the woodwork on it wasn't bad, it wasn't brilliant, but it, you know, it was competent how they'd done it. And I'll show you inside there as the video goes on. But anyway, I bought this amp and I also bought a speaker with it. And the speaker was pretty knackered, to be honest. And I use it as a stall in my workshop most of the time. But it's handy for testing amps, and I used it while I was testing this, although I did discover afterwards that the cone was actually blown. So I'm actually going to buy a decent speaker to go in the cab, because then I can obviously use it better testing, and also for if I need a cab at short notice for a gig or something, then there's always one there. But anyway, we're going to go to the workshop where I've stripped it down, and I'll take you from where I started filming, basically. If we look at the chassis, then we can tell that this is definitely designed for this amp, because if we look at the order, we've got volume, bass and treble. Well, that's standard for the Westminster. But then middle is here. Now, on a normal amp, it would go bass, middle, treble. But this is here. So this is designed for the amp. Same with our master volume at the end. So they've done this deliberately to make this amp. So it's definitely not a normal Dominator that's had things replaced. This is designed for it. And if we look on the inside, we can see quite clearly that there's no holes drilled for the EL84s that were normally in Westminsters, that would kind of be about here. This whole amp is designed for this, and somebody's pencil marked here where the wires go here and where the valves are based. Now, whether that was the person that did this in the factory, because, you know, we've got these cable clips that are just sort of glued here with the sort of the aluminium to sort of keep the wires in place, and it has all the feelings of this is literally something that's been knocked up one at a time in the factory because they've got some bits lying around. So this to me would suggest this is actually quite a rare amplifier. This then is the guts of our amplifier, and as you can see, it's a pretty messy state. Now, the weird thing about this amp was, I thought it was a different amp put into a larger chassis, but it's not, because I found some others of these on the internet. And we got here 3 pots mounted to the circuit board along with this bright switch. So that's a standard board, but then we've got these 2 trailing pots here. Now we've got this one that just has 1 wire on the end of it, and this was put into the top tone control, and then this is a master volume control. Now, why was this not on the original WEM Westminster amp that this was kind of based on? And if we turn the board over, then I think we can see our answer. And the answer is, you can see here there's been some cuts to the tracks, and there's some bodge wires here. So there's a cut here with this bodge wire going to here to this pot. So what they've done is this is a factory modification that they've used to add a post gain, if you like, or a master volume, and this additional tone pot. So this board is still the standard WEM Westminster 15, although really it's like a 10 watt amp. But it's been modified. Now the only reason I can think of is that they may have had some leftover chassis and they wanted to fill it up with something, and rather than it being a full WEM Dominator that has two EL84s and a bunch of other valves and much bigger transformers, so with us having these bodges here, why did they do this? Well, all I can think of is that they may have had some spare chassis and they wanted to repurpose some of these boards and put these gubbins into a bigger cabinet with more controls, and then it will be a sort of better looking product. But if we look at our output transformer here, it would be very doubtful that you could get 25 watts out of this transformer, but you could probably get about 15 or 16, because that's a similar sized transformer to what's in something like the Tweed Deluxe, which is a 12 watt amp. And I think the transformer in the Fender Blues Junior is roughly about a similar sort of size. So I kind of think maybe they have modded this somehow to get a few more watts out of it from the Westminster, I don't know. But if this is said to be a 15 watt amp, then I guess that's probably about right. And the same goes really for our mains transformer, which is looking a little bit crusty, but we've got our primary windings here going in, and then we've got a centre tap soldered in here. Our low tension wires come out of here to feed the valves, and then coming out of this bit here is our red wires, which is our high tension wires for the high voltage. But again, I wouldn't have thought this would really be able to deliver 25 watts comfortably. I mean, you're talking something, you know, almost approaching a Vox AC30 with that kind of power, but maybe a 10 watt amp or something, then yeah, I think that probably will do it. Now this was actually mounted up this way in the cabinet, and you can see that the top has got very dusty. But if we turn over and look at the bottom, it actually, the bit that was touching the chassis does look nice and clean. So hopefully this transformer will still work. Now I don't have many of the parts here yet that I've ordered for this board, but I'm obviously going to replace all the electrolytic capacitors, and I've got new valve bases on order because the old ones really were shockingly cruddy. And once I've done that, and also we've got to replace this main smoothing cap, then we might be in a position where we can actually give this some kind of test. Now I don't know what capacitor that's for there. These two resistors here, this is all part of our power supply circuit, so we got drop voltages there, so the joint there will be feeding the output valves, and then that one will be feeding the input valve, which I think is the valve that sits here. And yeah, hopefully we should get something going. There's a high voltage coupling cap there that we need to replace. This capacitor here I'm going to replace. This I'll replace. This one I'll replace. I think that's even though you can't read it on the capacitor, I found this photograph online of the amp, and I could read off that this was a 33 microfarad high voltage capacitor. So I've got some 450 volt capacitors. And the only other thing I might do is the two rectifier diodes here, I might replace them with two new 1N4007, which are 1000 volt top voltage rectifier capacitor diodes, and I think they can take an amp. Well, this isn't going to take an amp of current at HT, so if I replace those two as well, then it's just a belt and braces thing we don't have to check. Because obviously if those diodes were shorted or damaged, then we could damage the whole amplifier by high voltage AC hitting everything. So first thing I'm going to do then is I'm going to give this board a really good clean. One amusing thing to note was that there was this sticker in here saying new valve required. Well, if you'd seen the state of this amp when I first took it apart, the valves were just hanging out the valve bases because the valve bases had lost all grip. And actually the valves that were in it were all looked to be sort of fairly brand new. So I actually don't think the valve needs replacing at all, but the base it was fitted in definitely does. I've got all of this out in the workshop here, and as you can see, It's cleaned up quite well. The board's quite neat and tidy now. So I'm going to start swapping out components and changing parts. I'm going to change everything, but I'm going to change all the big stuff, so the electrolytics, etc. Now, with these additional pots that we have here that were wired in, they sat side by side. So this is our mid-range and this is our master volume. Now, there's only one wire going to this pot, so how does it connect up? Well, I found this photograph, and you can see that there's a resistor joining the two. And if I zoom in on that picture, then you can see it's actually a 1.5k resistor. So that's going to be really easy. All I have to do is hook a 1.5k resistor between the middle lug here and ground here. Something else we can see here is that we have this can cover here, which is to, I guess, earth or isolate the valve from any noise. Now this is, you know, quite rusty and old, but it's hooked up to this pot here. Now there should be at least two, and you can see the wire is still here for the one that would have probably gone to that valve there. Now I guess they just wanted to isolate any kind of hum or noise. I don't know if these are particularly necessary, but I will probably replace that bit of wire, and I will put this back, although I don't have one for here. I mean, I might just find an old piece of metal and see if I can bend it and make one, because, you know, at least it kind of keeps it age appropriate there. But the first thing I'm going to do then is with the main chassis, and I'm going to rewire all the mains points, and then I will probably fit the transformer back into the chassis, and then we can start wiring things in. Okay, well, as you can see, I've got our mains all installed. So the mains comes into the switch here, comes out of the switch and goes into the fuse, comes out the fuse, and it's joined on this side of the neon light with the plus going into the transformer, and then the negative is going to the other side of the light. Now, first thing you're probably asking is, why have I wired this up to the bulb when I haven't tested it? Well, I put my meter across it and it's showing resistance, so I think that's probably okay. The second thing you might want to know is, why is it that I always heat shrink all the mains when I don't necessarily heat shrink the EHT? Well, there's an old saying that my old electronics lecturer at college, John Murray, used to say, and it was this: it's volts that jolts, it's mils that kills. And while, yes, you can easily die from touching the HT of a valve amplifier, the current is generally quite low. But even so, the HT on this is probably going to be about 350 volts. That's not that much more than the main supply, so it's still very high. But if you get your pinkies on the mains here, the main supply may be lower, yes, 250 volts, or maybe 230, depends where you are really, because it does fluctuate. But up to what you can get through the cable, i.e. what's on the fuse, you could easily get 5 amps of mains electricity in you, and that will kill you. So it's always good practice, any live mains, that you keep it protected and covered. Now, one thing I quite like about this circuit board is that the pads are quite generous, so I was actually able to thread through my new capacitor and then bend the leg before I solder it, and doing that means that it's going to have much more mechanical strength than if you just had the leg sticking out vertically. Well, here's the thing, I got this capacitor here, which is 15 microfarads at 40 volts. Now, I didn't have that value, so what I did is I piggybacked a 10 and a 4.7, and I fitted that in here. So, you know, it's not the most elegant of things, but it, you know, it does work and it's functional and it's mechanically as strong as if I just shoved a 16 microfarad in, which I don't have. And they're also rated at 50 volts, so we've got that little bit of extra headroom that we probably don't need, but you know, best to be safe really. Right then, so where are we now? Well, I've replaced a number of components. I've replaced the 2 diodes here for 1000 volt diodes, so that they're perfectly safe to use, high voltage rather than low voltage. This capacitor's been changed, obviously, as I said, that I had to join 2 together to make the value up. That capacitor's changed, that capacitor's changed. I'm waiting for that one and that one so I can replace those 2. And I've tested these resistors and they check out fine. And so yeah, so all the electrolytics are done. and hopefully, oh, and also, yes, I've cleaned these pots as well, and I've cleaned the other pots. So hopefully once these parts arrive to replace that, and the valve bases, then I can put all this back together in the chassis, and then we should be at a position where we can actually do some testing and see if this thing works. Now, I know I'm jumping around a bit on here, but this is the cabinet that it was in. Now, that may look to you like it's a traditional amp head, but it's not. What they've actually done, this was a combo amp. They were all combo amps, but they've cut it down and turned it into a head. Now, the interesting thing about this is, when I've been researching this on the internet, there's been quite a few that have been turned into heads, which makes me kind of think, was this a thing they did in the factory? But looking at the workmanship on this, I'd say it probably wasn't done in the factory. But the cabinet itself is actually very cheap. It's kind of all made of chipboard, which, you know, is you know, the 70s MDF really, and it's, you know, it's a little bit rubbish, to be honest, but you know, it's how it was done. I mean, what they've done is they've literally cut the bottom off. And if I turn the cabinet around, we'll probably see a bit closer. And they've actually just chopped the bottom and the top off, and they're actually holding it together with a hinge that's held up the other way. So, you know, a little bit of ingenuity there, but that's what this is. So, yeah, they've just sliced the bottom, sliced off the top, bolted it together, and stuck some form of covering on it. And here we've got the actual back of the amplifier. Now, this is original, and it's even got its serial number. Now, this would have been about this height, because it would have been an open-backed combo. So the amplifier would have sat behind these grills, and then there would be a speaker underneath it, sort of round about here. So what I am going to have to do to this is I need to have some sort of way of getting a speaker output fitted to this back plate. And what I have is this is a period correct jack mounting socket that you would have seen on Marshall's, Sound City, WEM, any kind of amplifier manufacturer. And there's like a bog standard kind of jack socket that would have been on an amp like this. So I'm going to fit this somewhere on the back of the amp, drill a hole, and then that way that will be our speaker output. And as we're in March, it's time to turn over the Ian Beale calendar for this month. So let's see what delights that we have for March 2024 from the King of Walford. There we go. Safe to say a slightly distressed looking Ian Beale for March. Okay, I've gone handheld now, so sorry if it looks a little bit wobbly. But what I've got is, we've got our transformer here, and I've just hooked it up to my voltmeter. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to just switch the power on, and to check that everything works and we get voltage coming out of the transformer. So we'll switch it on, and our light's on. Let's look at our voltmeter. 522 volts AC, so the HT is definitely working fine on the transformer. So we'll just turn the power off. And now we've got our voltmeter connected to the heater wires, the low tension. Again, I'm standing at distance, so I'm not touching anything, because obviously we're talking very high voltages here. I'm going to switch the power on. And it's saying it's 7.3 volts, so that's with no load on. So that's probably about right, because obviously once there's a load on there, then the voltage will come down a little bit. So the transformer is definitely working, as is our indicator light. Well, here's our circuit board then, and I've replaced another cap, this one here, which you can probably just see if I just tilt the board up. That turned up the other day. But we've got our new valve bases, and these are ceramic bases, so they're good with heat, and they've got gold plated pins, and so I'm now going to fit the valve bases to the circuit board. Now, many do say that if you actually put the valve in the base before you solder the base in, then it makes it much easier for getting the valve in and out of the board. So I've got our valve placed in the base there, and now I can just solder the pins to the circuit board. But what I will do first is gently bend the pins slightly so that they're flush with the board, so that they're mechanically a lot stronger before I add the solder. Now actually what you can do is you can just slot the socket in, bend the pins, then put a valve in. I'm actually using the preamp valve just as a guide, because you know you could potentially damage the valve, But if I put in a valve that I know I've got a spare of, then it's not so bad. So they're now in place. And then I can just solder in the rest of the legs to the board, which is actually really easy to do because these gold plated pins take solder really well. Well, after popping these in, I've decided to put the board back in the chassis because I can see that I've got to put that capacitor in there, but you can actually access it through the underside of the board, so that's not a problem. And I've put these pots in. That's our 1.5k resistor that goes from this middle position to the ground of the master volume, and I also did rewire this one as well because the solder wasn't particularly good. And I think basically every solder joint that's come off the board as well, I've remade every joint. I've just desoldered, snipped the wires and then resoldered them again, with the exception actually of the input jack here, which I'm going to actually just resolder now just to make it neat and tidy. But then other than that, I've just got to wait for the rest of the capacitors and then we can do some testing. Okay, it's the next day, and if we look at the amp, you can see I've got our new capacitors in, and I've actually mounted them on a tag strip which is fixed to the chassis. Now, because the negatives go to ground, I've also got that going to ground. Now, before anyone says, oh, you might get a ground loop or a hum or something, well, the grounding point is here. So we're only going between here and here, so it's effectively double grounded. And I kind of think, well, you know, if nothing else, it's a bit of extra safety. So we've got our two capacitors here, they're all wired in, and that capacitor there I've also replaced. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of testing. Okay, well I'll let you into a little secret. I have actually already done a quick test, which is why my voltmeters were fiddling around with millivolts, because there's still a little bit of a redundant electricity in the capacitors. But what I've got is I've got one probe on the output that feeds the two valves through the transformer there, and I've got the other going to ground. So I'm standing behind the camera and I'm just going to switch the amp on. And there we go, we've got 351 volts, 352 volts, which is pretty much exactly what we should have for this amp. So as far as I'm concerned, that's good. So I'm going to turn the power off now. And if you look at the voltmeter, you can see it's going down, but it's going down slowly. So you must take extra special care. If you've done a test and you've put some volts on something, then always wait for the capacitors to discharge, and also always unplug the mains as well. Right, what I'm going to do next then is I'm going to put the valves in, because obviously I didn't have the valves in there because I just wanted to check the voltages, and then we'll hook it up to a speaker and I'll stick some tone in it and see if we get any sound out of it. Okay, here we go then. So our amp is hooked up with its valves. I've got the voltmeter on the supply just to keep an eye on things. I've got a test tone going in and it's all switched on and the speaker is connected. So let's see what happens. And well, our our output, you know, our main valves are certainly heating up, which is a good sign. We're starting to hear something. Yeah. Yeah. We got sound, not very good sound. We're getting a little bit of hum, I think, if I turn this off. Yeah, not too much though. We've got a bit of a noisy pot there. Yeah, that pot's really noisy. As is that pot. And these are okay, so I might give the pots another clean. I mean, there could be some DC on there, so we might need to double check the coupling capacitors. But in essence, this amp, I am happy that it is working. But yeah, we need to do something about these noisy pots. Just check our little switch here. Right, okay, so that's not good. That's very bad. So yeah, I think we're going to need to replace the rest of the capacitors in this amp. So it's, and then we should be okay, but yeah, that's a bit noisy. But otherwise, the amp is working. It's just got a bit of a noisy tone circuit, and we've got these capacitors here, these these little rectangular ones. So they're all the ones I'm going to replace. And I have got a circuit diagram for this amp, so it shouldn't be too hard just to double check everything and swap them out. But once that's done, then I think we should be okay. But I'm pleased anyway that the amp is basically working. Okay, well, I've changed the caps, and it's certainly made a lot of difference. And if you can look at the voltmeter here, you can see that there's no DC now leaking onto the pot, so they're not making as much noise. And I also changed the capacitor that is for the treble boost, and so that's not noisy, but there is some noise. Well, I've just given the volume pot a service because this old CTS pot, it had a dead spot as you were turning it, and the inner ring inside it I gave a really good clean to because there were some bumps on it. And I've tested it on my meter, and it seems to be a lot better. Okay, well, I had to remake this pot because it was the middle leg had actually come out of alignment, and that was where the brushes rub to get the link. So as you were turning it was going clunk. So now I've fixed that. I'm hoping that we might actually get it working now. This little culprit was the problem, and I'll show you on the schematic why. This is our first stage of amplification here, and the signal coming out goes through this 220 picofarad capacitor, and this was the capacitor that was duff, so it was giving me DC and horrible muck going into all of the tone circuit, and some of that was split out for the modification to add the middle, and so that was just making everything a mess. So by replacing that capacitor, everything's good. And there's our new capacitor. Now, I did order some, and then I realised I actually had some spares, so I just thought I'd bung one of these in. And the reason that is so much bigger is because it's actually rated at 15 kilovolts, because these are actually ones made for televisions, but it still does the job, so I popped it in there and it all does work. Now, on this section here, you might notice I've changed this and I've put a big chunky resistor in. The reason I've done this is because I happen to have some 1.5k resistors that were nice and chunky, and I just thought it just looks nicer and it feels more rigid, so I've kept that there. But otherwise, this amp is now complete, and I have tested it and everything is now working. So the next job is I'm going to pop the knobs back on the front, pop the valves back in, and stick it all back in the cabinet. Here then's our amp all boxed up, and as you can see, I fitted our speaker socket exactly where I wanted to put it, and on the back it looks quite neat, to be fair. And here's the front of our head. Now, I do need to go and give the cabinet a quick wipe over with some soapy water or some glass clean or something just to tidy it up. I should have really done that before I mounted the chassis back in, but there's our amp all finished. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take it up the road, plug it into a decent cab, and we'll have a listen to it. Okay, just before I do the sound demo, I kind of decided I think it would sound a bit better if I just add a bit of reverb. So what you're going to hear is just the guitar and the amp and a speaker, but I've added a little bit of reverb to it just because it makes it sound nicer. Okay, this is going to be a bit of a rough and ready demo, really. I've just got my trusty old Charvel plugged in, mainly because it's got a good variation of pickups. Now, the amp's plugged in. I've got the bass actually cranked up almost to full. The middle's kind of in the middle and the treble's in the middle. And I've got our pre-volume set to 5 and the master set to 5. And it goes from 0 to 8. And we get really a fairly good, respectable, clean sound. And if I go to sort of single coil mode, I can get sort of... Just bring the volume up a little bit. And you know, it's actually pretty loud. It's pretty... So I'm going to turn the master down now, and I'm going to crank the pre volume up full and use the humbucker pickup. So this is kind of the most overdrive you can kind of get out of this amp using its pre gain. So yeah, it's not too heavy on the drive, but what you got to remember with this amp is it was never really meant as like a proper master volume amp like, say, a Marshall. I think the idea of having a pre-gain and a post-gain is more if you were going to use this for other things. And by that, we are talking the 70s. So you'd be thinking of things like maybe a keyboard or an organ or a tape recorder, which would have much higher gains. So you'd need to bring the gain down in order to get the sound without any kind of distortion. Now, if I turn the master volume up full, and we've got our main volume to the middle, that's still giving us a very loud, clean sound. And I'll turn the middle control up a bit more. Middle's now up at full. I'm going to push the little bright button in now. So yeah, that's actually quite nice. It gives it a little bit more oomph. And so I'm going to turn the treble right up now. So effectively now all our tone controls are at full. I'll just turn the bright off again. Yeah, that's not a bad sound. Not a bad sound at all. Now there is an inherent hum on this amp. It's quite low level, but when I had a WEM Westminster before, it wasn't the Westminster, or was it a Clubman? It was one of it was virtually a similar type amp anyway. Again, that also had a bit of low level hum, but you know, it's nothing that's too annoying, to be honest. And certainly if we crank this right up now, so this is it flat out. So it's pretty loud. Now, would I say it's 25 watts as the label suggests? No, I would say it's comparable to, say, my little El Pico amp or a Fender Blues Junior, something like that. So we are talking, I would say you're probably getting something like 15, 16 watts out of it. Maybe 20 at a push, but you're saying the output transform is not all that big. I mean, it's reasonable, but it's not huge. But I would say this is actually a pretty decent amp, and if you're not too worried about volume, you could certainly gig with this without any hesitation. And certainly if I was doing a that was just using the middle pickup. Now, if I was going to use this for a gig, I'd have no hesitation in using it, and I will take this out and play this amp live, because, you know, what's the point in restoring an amp if you're not going to use it? So probably the next blues gig I do, I think be most suitable, then yeah, I'll be using this, and hopefully I'll get some good results out of it. Anyway, enough of me noodling. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please like and subscribe. And if you own one of these amps or you've seen them around, please leave a comment in the comment section and just, tell me what you think of them. Tell me what memories you have of these amps, because as I said at the start of the video, these are not common. There's a lot of WEM amps out there, but there's a lot of WEM Dominators out there. But this isn't really a WEM Dominator. This is a WEM Westminster 15 that's had this little tweak done. So we've added this middle control and we've added the master volume to it. And it should have been in a 1x12 combo, but it's not. But, it's still, it's functional. And I don't think this amp's probably been used in maybe, I don't know, 20 years possibly. And somebody obviously tried to have a go at fixing it and couldn't. But anyway. It's fixed now. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.